Hi, I'm Nicole Ferraro, and this is The Divide, a podcast from Light Reading exploring the ongoing digital divide, why and where it still exists, and what needs to be done to get people everywhere connected to reliable, high-speed internet. Today I'm speaking with Eli Dvorkin and Rachel Neches from the Center for an Urban Future. They joined me to discuss a report that they published in July entitled Understanding and Overcoming the Bronx Digital Divide. The report explores the state of broadband access, adoption, and affordability for residents of the Bronx and New York City, including why the digital divide is particularly stark for Bronx residents compared to other New York City neighborhoods, what solutions are working, how the city can further support initiatives to close the digital divide in the Bronx, and more. Eli and Rachel, welcome to the podcast. So nice to meet you. I'm really excited to get to talk with you both today about your important report on the digital divide in the Bronx. But since it's both your first time on this podcast and our first time meeting each other, I would love for you to just briefly introduce yourselves and tell us about your roles at the Center for an Urban Future and a bit about what the Center for an Urban Future does. So Eli, let's start with you and then go over to Rachel.
Hey, thanks so much, Nicole. It's really great to be with you. We're a research and policy think tank based in New York City, focused on creating a stronger and more inclusive economy for all New Yorkers. So we publish policy reports that are widely read in New York City and state by government leaders, private sector leaders, and folks in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors. And I'm really proud that our research frequently leads to policy impact in areas that help more New Yorkers get connected, get ahead, get on the path to the middle class. And that's what led us to focus some of our research on issues around the digital divide.
Excellent. Rachel?
Thanks so much, Nicole, for having us. My name's Rachel, and I lead data research at CUF. And one of the things that I love most about what we do here is using data to really tell stories. And I think this report is a great example of that. So thanks for having us today.
My pleasure. I'm super excited to dive into this report. For people who are unfamiliar with New York City, the Bronx is one of the five boroughs here, and where I went to college. But you guys focus specifically on the digital divide. I'm going to leave it to you to jump in, each of you, when you want to answer questions, since you both worked on this report. But just to start with, let's talk about some background on the report that you guys conducted. How was it commissioned? Why was it commissioned? What did you guys set out to learn? And why would you consider the Bronx in particular I know you were asked to do this report, but why is the Bronx, from your learnings, a good case study for the digital divide?
Yeah, well, happy to start, Nicole. I mean, actually, just a point of clarification, we really wanted to do this specific report on the Bronx.
Okay.
Or that the Center for Urban Future initiated. We got support from the Bronx Community Foundation to do it. We wanted to do this focus on the Bronx because we had reason to believe, suspicions, that we would see the greatest digital divide in the Bronx of any borough. Unfortunately, though, that hunch was borne out. But we thought, in our increasingly tech-enabled and tech-powered economy in New York, in an economy in which 41% of all the net new jobs in New York City since the pandemic have been in tech, where tech skills, where a broadband connection, where devices are essential for accessing job training and education and healthcare and social services, that we wanted to understand, what does the digital divide look like in the Bronx today? And most importantly, what are some of the key steps that policymakers should be taking to help close that divide? Because as our research at CUF focuses on economic opportunity and economic mobility, it's become inescapably clear that it's impossible for New York to help more Bronx residents participate fully in our increasingly tech-powered society and gain access to the education and skills needed to thrive in an increasingly tech-powered economy without closing the digital divide. So that's really what kind of led us to doing this research in the first place.
Got it. Okay. And thanks for clarifying that. Rachel, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, what I can do is talk a little bit about what we learned in the report.
Sure. Actually, before you get into that, let me tee up the question for you so I can get to some specifics there. Because we're going to, of course, get into a lot of learnings from the report. But, the digital divide tends to come down to multiple factors, whether it's, access to the actual broadband technology, affordability issues, adoption issues. So what were the main issues that you guys uncovered in your report that are creating the digital divide for Bronx residents, and how is that, actually how are those impacts felt in the community?
Yeah, so we set out to really try to understand and capture what exactly is the digital divide in the Bronx today. And the three things that we found to be most important were device access, affordability, and computing education.
Mm-hmm.
The Bronx has one of the deepest digital divides of any county in the country, really. And here's what we mean by that. And as the data researcher, I'll help give some numbers to paint a picture here. Compared to the rest of the city, the Bronx is at like a very serious disadvantage. More than 1 in 5 households lack broadband. That's like double the rate of Manhattan, which is just a few miles away when you think about it. At the same time, Bronx residents are quite behind when it comes to device access. Our research showed that 1 in 3 households lack a computer at home. That's like the highest share of any borough. I even talked, through interviews with experts doing this stuff on the ground every day. I talked to one computer lab coordinator at a workforce development program in the Bronx that estimated that 80% of his students didn't have a working laptop at home. And that's what, brought them into the program.
80%?
Yeah. At the computer lab.
Okay.
Of course, that's a need for access point, but still revealing that it's a concern. Yeah. And when it comes to digital literacy and computing education, the third major issue area that we found, while there are some incredible organizations already doing this work on the ground, there's a lot of room to scale up.
Right.
And on the education standpoint or point, in 2023, only around 11% of Bronx students were enrolled in a computer science course, which is the lowest share of any borough. So, we recognize that it's nearly impossible to participate fully in our increasingly digital society without making major strides to close these gaps. And, it's not just a tech gap, but it's also an obstacle to going to school, finding a job, seeing a doctor, getting city services, and real full participation in our economy.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to the digital literacy piece, the access to devices, because I think there's a lot there that we could be doing more of, and I want to hear a bit about how we are doing it. But just to jump to affordability for a second, what did you guys learn about the affordability barriers when it comes to broadband access in the Bronx? And my understanding is that the ACP had played a pretty significant role in connecting households there, and but of course it has since ended. So how has the end of the ACP impacted affordability?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to start, and then Rachel can definitely jump in.
Yeah.
She led our research on the ACP program as well. But I think the starting point is actually that our research really underscored the extent to which affordability is by far the greatest barrier to broadband adoption in the Bronx. And I mention that in part because I've spoken to a lot of policymakers in New York City over the years about issues around the digital divide. And up to this day, I would say I think there's a misperception that a lot of policymakers have that by far the biggest issue is infrastructure. The good news is that in New York City, well over 99% of households are able to access broadband internet. Now, the speeds vary. Not every unit in every building is wired, for example, with fiber cable. There are still some challenges at the building level. There are still some areas where speeds are much higher on one side of the block than the other side of the block. But on a basic level, the Bronx, like the rest of New York City and like most of New York State, is wired for broadband. what I think policymakers have struggled to keep pace with is the extent to which the biggest barrier to adoption is cost, is affordability. So our report really underscored that. And it's unsurprising in one of the poorest counties in the nation that affordability is the biggest issue. But the Bronx, actually, residents in the Bronx, we found pay more on average than residents of the rest of the state. They pay among the highest rates of any county in New York State. So clearly, there's a big mismatch there in terms of both the service that's available, the price points that are available, but also Bronx residents' adoption of lower cost plans. And I'll mention two quick points about that. One is the state has now instituted mandatory $20 a month plans or less through the ABA, the Affordable Broadband Act. This was a long time coming. The legislation was passed years ago. It worked its way through the courts for several years. It was finally, enacted in January. And now we're in a new reality as a state where we have a mandatory benefit, which is not a reduction, a credit like the ACP, but the mandating the availability of low cost, plans statewide. So one of the big challenges now in the Bronx, like the challenge we saw with the ACP, was adoption of this benefit. And on that score, New York City and the Bronx in particular did phenomenally well when it comes to the ACP. New York State and New York City in particular led the nation in enrolling residents in the ACP credit. And in fact, nearly half of all households in the Bronx received the ACP credit. We've seen some evidence to suggest that broadband adoption has faltered since the expiration of ACP. And in the Bronx in particular, where $30 a month makes a big difference, especially for the large number of Bronx households that are living below the poverty line today. So the introduction of a new affordable broadband tier, we think, can be really helpful in a place like the Bronx. But adoption is still going to be the challenge, and it doesn't mean that just because the plan is now mandated, that hundreds of thousands of Bronx residents are signing up for those plans. The data certainly suggests that hasn't happened yet. And a lot's got to happen on the ground to invest in community-based organizations, trusted partner organizations, to actually walk Bronx residents through the process of enrolling in those low-cost plans if we're going to see adoption to anything close to the level that we saw with the ACP credit.
Yeah. And I'm sure gaining a benefit and then losing a benefit and gaining a benefit and losing a benefit doesn't exactly encourage people to trust in what's being offered to them.
Yeah, exactly right. And the reality is, what worked with ACP was were committed partnerships with trusted community-based organizations. For instance, the city's branch libraries
Right.
alone were one of the key vectors in actually boosting ACP adoption in New York City, enrolling thousands and thousands of residents across the 5 boroughs. They're not the only partners that succeeded and made that effort a success. But they were really key in part because there's a branch library in nearly every community across New York City, but also in large part because libraries are trusted at a time when trust in government is low and falling.
Yeah.
Trust in libraries as social infrastructure remains really high. So it's been a real lesson for New York in terms of the power of leveraging trusted community-based organizations to get the word out, to actually not just get the word out, but facilitate the signups. A lot of providers told us, look, it wasn't just tabling or putting up a flyer. It was really handholding, actually sitting down next to a resident side by side at the computer screen and walking them through the process. But it worked. We saw the impact of how successful that effort was with ACP. Now, unfortunately, we have to start that process all over again with the ABA program. But if we put into practice some of the same efforts that were successful with ACP, I think we can get to a place where many, many more Bronx residents are paying a fraction of what they do today for broadband.
Yeah. Rachel, I want to bring you in, and then I have a couple of notes on this topic. But Rachel, I know you did some ACP work, so please take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Eli said it, captured it perfectly. I mean, we started this, we did some research at the end of the ACP last year as it was ending. And as we said, we revealed that nearly 1 million households were in New York City were enrolled in the ACP, receiving that discount, which also means that 1 million households were at risk of losing the benefit. And when it came to the Bronx, nearly half of all Bronx households were the most vulnerable as they were enrolled. But it also showed that the Bronx was one of the most successful counties in getting its residents enrolled. right at the same time. So one of those lessons that we can learn from the rollout in the program is how critical it is to invest in these robust public awareness campaigns and using partners like libraries and schools and community development organizations to make sure that everyone who's eligible, who may not know about the program, has access.
Yeah. So, okay. So a couple of things on everything that you guys have just been talking about. So the ACP, I followed it super closely. I was covering all of the effort to get people enrolled and all of the hard work that went into that. And a lot of that was done, like you guys are talking about, by trusted organizations, digital navigator groups, and such. We're now in an era where the digital equity funding at the federal level has been canceled. That I think was going to bolster a lot of groups like that do the kind of essential work that you guys are both talking about in terms of connecting people to these resources and to computers and to the internet. The NTIA yesterday put out guidance on BEAD that basically does not allow states to set the low cost service mandate anymore for that program. So that means any BEAD funded projects, which may not impact, I guess, the Bronx quite as much, but those projects are not going to be able to adhere to the New York State Affordable Broadband Act. And also BEAD appears to be being stripped of its, non-deployment funds and a variety of other things that were meant to, kind of lift communities up in the process of delivering them infrastructure. I know that New York State was still able to distribute some digital equity grants. I communicated with the state a couple of weeks ago and found out that they were reappropriating, state dollars to cover some of those grants instead. So I guess that's good. But I guess, how are you guys assessing all of this, given that the landscape this year is very different than the landscape we were dealing with last year? Even when the ACP was ending, options just seemed more available than they do now as everything is being stripped away. Also, I would just add that people getting kicked off of, various social safety net programs means that they're not going to be eligible for low-income broadband plans necessarily. So just throwing, the current state of the world in there to say, how does that affect, all this stuff that you guys say works that maybe isn't really as available right now?
Yeah, well, look, we can't mince words about this. The efforts that New York and so many other states have been making in recent years to close these gaps are under direct threat. The nearly $3 billion of federal funding alone is potentially a massive setback to these efforts. But if I can try to look on the bright side, or at least see where the glass might be half full, it's in the power of cities and states to step up in this moment and do more, or at least to recognize that so much of the potential to continue this work and to innovate has always existed at the state and local level. So you're absolutely right. New York State became the first state in the nation to continue to invest in its digital equity program through its Connect All grants. Just a few days ago, and that's $5 million of state funding to start to backfill the hole from the loss of those federal dollars. I think other states are going to follow suit and say, we're going to keep this work going, even if it means the state has to find ways to pay for it. Frankly, now is the time, because the other shoe that is going to drop in terms of the impact of the federal mega bill on states, we haven't felt it yet. So much of that impact is still to come. It's been pushed off, by Congress after the midterm elections. And it will cause massive fiscal damage to New York and other states, Medicaid, cuts in particular. But I would then argue that now is the time to invest the dollars that the state has to advance this work while we have some additional flexibility. And kudos to Governor Hochul and the state for starting to do that now. But so much is going to have to be done at the local level. And I think our report really shines a light on what New York City can do. Part of the answer is it can't backfill some of those holes. The state itself looked at the loss of the ACP and said, understandably, although somewhat frustratingly, that's a level of subsidy that the state can't absorb right now. And that's going to be even harder in the months ahead and the years ahead. But there is so much that the city and the state can do. So certainly the state is already signaling it's going to continue the Connect All work. That needs to be baselined, funded every year so that there's predictability and knowing those dollars are going to flow. And it will continue to do the work that's already underway to close the final remaining gaps in terms of infrastructure, for which there's still, 60,000 or so households statewide that don't actually have access to a high-speed internet connection. But I think most importantly, to invest in digital literacy, in AI literacy, in computing education, and yes, in broadband adoption and device access too. At the local level, that's where I think there's even more opportunity to do more. We've seen some moves in recent weeks, even to start to address some of the gaps that we highlighted in our report. Investing in the power of our library systems, for instance, to be partners in expanding access to broadband in affordable housing developments. We can talk more about that. Yeah. But we have some recommendations in our report that are city-sized, that don't require a massive new investment from the federal government, that aren't a substitute for what the federal government should be doing to continue to close these gaps, but that give the city ideas that the city can do on its own. And I think my overall message here is cities are going to have to step up and lead, as we have so many times in the past, when the federal government falters, or as the case right now, when the federal government is actually attacking those very initiatives that the city and the state have rightly championed. And we're going to have to continue to make the case to New Yorkers for why this is so important. Why, if we want to build an economy and a society where everybody can thrive, we can't push the brakes on closing the remaining gaps in our digital infrastructure. We can't stop the work that's advancing right now to make sure that every New Yorker has the skills and devices and broadband connection that they need to thrive in our increasingly tech-powered society. So, making that case is important, but the good news is that cities and states right here in New York and elsewhere can do a lot on their own.
Absolutely. Thank you. I like to bring us down in the dumps and then make my guests bring us back up on this podcast. So I appreciate the optimistic point of view. Rachel, did you want to add anything before I round this out with a final question here?
No, I mean, I think it's so true, right? At these challenging times, it's what the most hopeful thing to do is to look at what's working and look locally. I did just want to mention some of the amazing, highly effective community-based organizations and groups doing this work on the ground every single day. Yeah. When we started this research, we thought that we'd find organizations faced with really long waiting lists. And while this is definitely true for some, faced with resource constraints and capacity challenges, and overall struggling to scale up and keep with demand. We also found that even effective programs are going undersubscribed when they don't have the infrastructure or training efforts or capacity to meet people where they are. It's when we, in talking about, local sort of effective targeted interventions, this is when trusted community spaces and relationships with those populations and in multiple languages and flexible schedules and wraparound services becomes even more and more important. So a couple of groups that we talked to, one, for example, is an organization called SAPNA, which serves primarily low-income South Asian women in the Bronx. And, through their direct relationship with this community, who many are unfamiliar with digital literacy or on the scale of digital literacy, are able through their relationships with them to build trust and really understand their needs and fill them. So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to what's going on the ground, doing this work every day.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you mentioned those groups, because it really is these digital navigator type groups, community groups that make the difference here. These are the trusted entities that communities, will actually, work with. So I want to let you guys both go so you can get back to important work, closing the digital divide and all the other important work you do. But one final question, since you both talk about the importance of local efforts and such in New York City, you mentioned we've tried a few things. You mentioned in New York State, we have the Affordable Broadband Act, which went through a long period of time before it could be enacted, but now it's enacted and, probably needs some work to be successfully enforced, but it exists. Mayor Adams instituted Big Apple Connect a few years ago, which essentially looped in our incumbent providers, Optimum, I think, and Charter, to offer low-income service plans. And now we're starting a new pilot program called Liberty Link that aims to deliver free fiber broadband to affordable housing buildings in Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. So I just want to get your perspective. Obviously, Liberty Link doesn't exist yet, but I would love your perspective on the direction of that program, the size of the program, if that's the kind of pilot you're interested in seeing more of, and also if you have any sense of how well the Big Apple Connect program performed based on your research in the Bronx.
Yeah, well, happy to start there. So, I think, first of all, I think part of the solution for New York City right now is developing local plans. The state has its digital equity plan, a comprehensive plan, but one that can't, by design, get into the granular detail that's needed at the local level. And New York City also has a framework, a plan as well. But I actually think what's needed right now is a Bronx digital equity plan, and that would make all of those city and state investments much more specific and granular. It would detail opportunities to leverage the infrastructure that already exists in the Bronx, the social infrastructure, the CBOs, like Rachel was talking about, and it would put forward really specific ideas, many of which are in our report, to boost broadband adoption, to address device access, and to invest in digital literacy and computing education. So let me mention a couple examples of that, and also I can address how the city's doing. I mean, in terms of Big Apple Connect, the focus was just on NYCHA residents, so public housing residents in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. Public housing residents citywide. So far that program has reached, I think, about 84% of eligible households, of NYCHA households. So it's made some really good progress. It also suggests or underscores that there's always a way to travel when it comes to meeting people where they are. Just because the program offers free internet, home broadband, doesn't mean you're instantly going to get to anything close to 100% uptake. So it's made progress. There's a ways to go. There's potentially a risk for the next mayor in that program, in that it's a contract with those two ISPs, and the contract is limited to a few years, 3-year term. So the city will have to decide, as that contract comes up for renewal, are the ISPs going to negotiate a higher rate? Is the city willing to continue to absorb that cost on an ongoing basis? Does that become more challenging given the overall fiscal environment that the city's facing? And frankly, any decisions that are about a free program or a subsidy that covers 100% of the cost at anything close to market rates is going to run into those challenges around scale. At the same time, there's a lot of other things that we think that the city can continue to do. Certainly, boosting a targeted campaign to boost enrollment in the ABA mandated plans is one of those things. And powering that work with community partners. A couple of things that strike us as really important models. I do think that Liberty Link, the pilot program between the city's housing agency and the New York Public Library, is a really promising model. And it's starting with 2,200 households that receive Section 8 housing vouchers. That's a great start. There are, well over 14,000 more Section 8 households, just in the Bronx. There are thousands and thousands more citywide. So if that program is successful, and I think we have every reason to believe it will be successful, there is a real opportunity to expand that model through other partnerships with all 3 library systems and Section 8 households, affordable developments all over the 5 boroughs. But I'll mention a couple other things too. When it comes to devices, we propose in our report the idea of establishing a Bronx laptop lending library. And the idea there is for those more than 184,000 households in the Bronx that don't have a computer at home, the city could help create a program that would recycle laptops and other computers, getting donations from major corporations or anchor institutions like hospitals, pairing them with a refurbishment pipeline. So potentially that's a job training program in of itself in partnership with, let's say, a Bronx CUNY school or a high school that would create a steady supply of usable laptops, while also helping to train Bronx residents or young people on how to refurbish a device. That's a model that could potentially scale to a whole borough. Right now, we've got a couple of nonprofits in New York City that do versions of this, as there are in other places. but they're mostly doing this in tens and hundreds, not, at the scale of thousands. There's a big opportunity, I think, for the city to scale up an idea like that. And one other thing I'll mention that feels so important to this work is all the things that the city can do and that the city can control around digital literacy and tech and computing education. So just to mention a couple, right now the city's got a really innovative program at its public colleges, the City University of New York, called CUNY 2X Tech. And put simply, this is a set of different programs that are designed to help CUNY students who are pursuing technology degrees to actually succeed in technology careers, to get internships, paid internships in tech, to embed instructors from the tech sector to actually come to CUNY and teach a course for a semester. When students have access to these CUNY 2X programs, they're not only more likely to complete their degrees, they're far more likely to land paid internships and jobs in tech after graduation. The problem right now is that the Bronx's CUNY schools don't have CUNY 2X Tech yet. So it's a clear opportunity for the city to say, hey, let's take something that's already working, let's bring it to the Bronx. At Bronx Community College, at Ostos Community College, the two CUNY community colleges in the Bronx. But I'll mention one other thing that is, I think, essential for this work, and that is building computing education into our K through 12 schools. As Rachel mentioned earlier, the Bronx up with Lower Manhattan, with Upper Manhattan, the Bronx is tied with Upper Manhattan in the lowest share of students participating in computing education in any given year in our public schools. And that's really not anywhere close to where we need to be. So we have a recommendation in the report. It's actually also a recommendation to invest in scaling up something that's working, but it's a program at CUNY, also the Computing Integrated Teacher Education Program, which is training our future K through 12 teachers to integrate computational thinking into their classroom. So the idea here is this is not standalone computer science classes for high school juniors or seniors. We need those too. And despite the rumors about the demise of coding, software engineering jobs are still growing in New York, but entry-level jobs, for sure, the market has gotten much, much tighter. But this isn't about just that. It's about building computational thinking and fluency across K through 12, because those skills are in demand across our economy, not just in tech, but in healthcare, in finance, in real estate, in construction. All of these industries where we see jobs growing, they're increasingly requiring tech skills. And that those skills don't just mean kind of hard coding skills, but it's the building blocks of computational thinking, the foundation of computational thinking that needs to be established across our educational system or across our public school system. We're still a long way from realizing that vision in New York City. The Bronx in particular is lagging behind. It's a big reason why by the time students are offered the opportunity to opt in to computer science in high school, we see that white students, that male students, that Asian students are more likely to opt in. It's not because there's any inherent differences in capabilities or even interest, but there is a big gap in terms of participation and belonging at the earliest years in our education system. So our recommendation is actually very simple. It's train every future teacher to be able to integrate computational thinking into their classrooms. And we can do that through CUNY because 1/3 of all new teachers in New York City public schools every year come from our public colleges. So if we can affect that pipeline of future teachers, we could be preparing hundreds of thousands of our future students to become not just competent in computing, but passionate about what technology can do. And that's how we can ultimately affect that future pipeline of not only tech sector workers, but of New Yorkers who are not only using technology every day, but creating it. And we want to see a future where the technology that we are all using every day is being created by young people who were born and raised in the Bronx.
Yeah. I love these suggestions. I hope you're getting them in front of all of our mayoral candidates for November. And I like how you hit on, the short-term needs and the long-term needs with these recommendations. I think that brings us to the end. But Rachel, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I guess the only thing I might throw in there is, as we talked about earlier, some of those incredible Bronx-based organizations like Perscolis and the Knowledge House on the workforce development side, right? Which are every single day helping residents get the skills they need for those in-demand tech jobs, which is like the fastest growing sector in the city right now. Again, as we've talked about, scaling up what's already working. they have limited capacity a lot of the time. I know I talked to someone at the Knowledge House who said that last year they had around 1,000 applications, but were only able to recruit around 190 students, right? So, the city should invest in scaling these proven training programs that have been around for years, and see where we can sort of support those participants through things like wraparound services and meeting them where they're at, and making those opportunities more accessible. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, no, my pleasure completely. Thank you both so much. This is a really thorough, excellent report and an inspiring conversation. So I really appreciate your time and hope to chat with you again.
Thanks so much, Nicole. It's a pleasure.
Thanks.
Thank you again, Rachel and Eli, for joining me. Thank you as well to Pierre Landriau for editing this episode. Be sure to subscribe to the Light Reading Podcast for more episodes of The Divide, as well as interviews and insights from the Light Reading team. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.